The call came at 3:07 on a Thursday morning. Months after my divorce from Trevor Maddox was final and after we stopped pretending we belonged in each other's lives, I watched his name glow until the screen went dark. Certain nothing ordinary crossed that distance. When I answered, I expected an emergency, but his breathing reached me first, followed by, Jocelyn left tonight, Caroline, and she left a note I cannot stop reading. I stayed quiet because silence was the honest thing I had left to give him. Trevor released a laugh, then read the line aloud, I don't recognize myself anymore when I'm with you. The words landed before their meaning did, because I had heard them across our kitchen table when my marriage ended. He had looked at me and used the same sentence, insisting he was not running toward another woman, only trying to recover the man he had lost. Now Jocelyn had returned those words to him, like something borrowed. Did I really say that to you? He asked. And for the first time since the divorce, his voice held no defense. I closed my eyes, remembering how carefully he had explained my abandonment, as though the right language could make betrayal sound necessary. Almost exactly, I answered, and the quiet stretched long enough for both of us to hear what it meant. Trevor murmured that he thought the sentence belonged to Jocelyn, as though she had created it instead of carrying it out of our marriage. Until that call, I believed Trevor had left because he loved someone else more than he loved me. I believed Jocelyn had offered him a brighter life, and that our years together had become too familiar to compete with her. Sitting alone with rain against the windows, I began to wonder whether either of us had ever been the reason he walked away. If the same sentence could survive one relationship and enter the next unchanged, maybe it had never belonged to any woman. Maybe it belonged to the story Trevor always needed before he could leave. 6 months earlier, I found out Trevor was having an affair because he chose to tell me before anyone else could. He came home unusually calm, sat across from me at the kitchen table where we had planned vacations and argued over paint colors, and quietly admitted there was someone else. He never reached for excuses or denial, only looked at me with the strange confidence of someone who had already rehearsed every sentence. When he finally whispered, I met someone who makes me feel like myself again, I realized he had walked into that conversation expecting resistance, not silence. I remember studying his face instead of his words because nothing about him looked ashamed. He wasn't asking for another chance or promising the affair would end, and that absence told me more than any confession could have. I asked only one question, whether he loved her enough to leave our marriage, and he answered without looking away. I wouldn't have told you if I hadn't already made that decision. The room became impossibly still because certainty sounded colder than anger ever could. The next few days passed with a strange efficiency that made everything feel older than it was. Trevor began gathering his clothes, books, and personal files while I contacted a family law attorney recommended through Hannah Cole, making sure every step followed Oregon's divorce process without unnecessary conflict. There were forms to organize, accounts to separate, and practical conversations neither of us had imagined having when we exchanged wedding vows. What unsettled me wasn't the paperwork, but how prepared Trevor already seemed to be, as though he had been living inside tomorrow while I was still standing in yesterday. As relatives and close friends gradually learned, we were separating. I noticed something that never fit together no matter how hard I tried. His mother believed we had simply grown apart. One coworker had heard I buried myself in work. Another friend thought we had stopped communicating years earlier. And someone else quietly hinted our marriage had become unhappy long before Jocelyn entered the picture. Every version ended with Trevor sounding like a man who had tried everything before finally giving up. Listening to those stories, I understood that while I had been learning how to end a marriage honestly, Trevor had already begun rewriting it for everyone who would ask. I went to Eleanor Maddox's house 2 weeks before the divorce papers were ready, because Trevor still had boxes stored in her garage. She welcomed me with the quiet kindness she had shown throughout our marriage, poured coffee without asking how I took it, and apologized for the awkwardness of seeing me under circumstances neither of us had expected. While she searched for the storage key, I stepped into the family room and noticed a shelf crowded with framed photographs. At first, I saw only younger versions of Trevor, then realized I did not recognize the women standing beside him. Eleanor returned, followed my gaze, and stopped near the doorway. She lifted one photograph and said, "That was Emily. They were engaged before you met him." Another frame showed Trevor beside a different woman at a mountain cabin, while a third captured him smiling on a beach years earlier. I asked why he had never mentioned any of them, and Eleanor lowered herself into a chair before answering, because every ending sounded different once Trevor started explaining it. She did not defend him, which made the room feel even quieter. Eleanor told me each relationship ended with Trevor insisting he had been unhappy for a long time, that he had stayed because he did not want to hurt anyone, and that someone new had finally reminded him who he was. The details shifted, but the shape never changed. As she spoke, the photographs stopped looking like family memories and began to resemble separate versions of the same goodbye. I asked, "Did he tell them what he told me?" Eleanor nodded without hesitation and answered, "Close enough that I could finish most of it before he did. I was the first woman he had married," she explained, "but not the first woman he had left after presenting himself as trapped inside a life that no longer fit." I felt no anger toward the women in those photographs, because each of them had once believed she was seeing a private truth no one else had reached. For the first time since Trevor confessed his affair, I wondered whether Jocelyn had been chosen for who she was, or whether she had simply arrived when he needed someone new to believe him. After Eleanor showed me the photographs, I began hearing fragments about Trevor and Jocelyn from people who assumed I already knew. They had moved into an apartment together before our divorce was final, and at first, their life sounded effortless, full of late dinners, weekend drives, and stories about how relieved they were to stop pretending. Trevor told friends that Jocelyn understood the parts of him I had never reached. Jocelyn told people she had finally found someone who let her feel free. That version lasted until ordinary life caught up with them. The trips became grocery lists, rent payments, laundry, and arguments over who had forgotten to call the landlord. Trevor started telling Owen that everything had changed too quickly, while Jocelyn complained that he had become distant now that there was nothing left to hide. Neither of them seemed to notice how often they described the other with words once reserved for former partners, and neither was willing to admit how familiar that language had become between them. I heard most of it indirectly, and I never asked for details because I was still learning how to separate curiosity from self-punishment. What stayed with me was the pattern inside the complaints. Trevor described himself as trapped by expectations, and Jocelyn described herself as diminished by someone else's needs. Each conversation left them sounding wounded, misunderstood, and blameless, even though they were now living inside the choice they had insisted would make them whole. The more their life settled, the more both of them returned to the past for proof that the present was not their fault. Trevor spoke about our marriage as if he had escaped it alone, while Jocelyn spoke about her former relationships as if every man had tried to contain her. When one of them said, "You don't understand what I gave up," the other answered with a version of the same sentence. They had chosen each other because both knew how to make a new beginning sound like rescue. But once the beginning ended, neither knew how to live without rewriting what came before. Miles Donovan called me a few weeks later, asking if I had time for coffee because there was something he thought I deserved to know. He had been Trevor's closest friend since college, yet he never sounded eager to defend him or eager to condemn him. After a long silence, he admitted he had watched the same pattern repeat often enough that he no longer believed any relationship had ever ended the way Trevor described it. Then he looked at me and quietly said, "There was never a different speech, Caroline. Only different audiences." He told me Trevor always believed every new woman understood him in a way no one else ever had. During the first months, Trevor spoke with complete certainty, convinced he had finally found the person who saw the real version of him. Months later, the language always shifted until he began describing himself as misunderstood again. Listening to Miles, I realized the sentence Trevor had repeated to me had survived because he kept carrying it into every new beginning. A few days after that conversation, I attended the opening of a local exhibition and unexpectedly found myself speaking with a woman who knew Jocelyn through the luxury travel industry. She had no idea who I was and casually mentioned that Jocelyn had always been drawn to men who were already committed because she believed those relationships revealed who people really were. Before we drifted apart, she laughed softly and said, "Once they become available, something changes, and she usually leaves within a year." I stood there holding the same glass of sparkling water, unable to decide whether I had just heard gossip or another missing piece. The two conversations stayed with me because neither person had tried to persuade me of anything. Miles described Trevor without bitterness, and Jocelyn's former friend described her without cruelty. Yet both stories curved in exactly the same direction. Trevor believed every ending proved he had never been understood, while Jocelyn believed every beginning proved she had finally found someone different. For the first time, I stopped seeing them as the man who betrayed me and the woman he chose, and started seeing two people who had unknowingly fallen in love with the same illusion. By the time Trevor called me again, the story he had built around Jocelyn was breaking apart. He opened with, "She keeps changing what happened," then rushed through 3 versions of the same argument, each placing him in a different room at a different time. When I asked which version Jocelyn believed, he snapped, "That isn't the point. Caroline. She's making me sound dishonest." I listened because the contradiction was not hidden inside his explanation. It was the explanation. A week later, Jocelyn contacted me for the first time. She began carefully, insisting, "I'm not asking you to take sides. I need to know whether he did this with you too." She described Trevor denying conversations she remembered, then repeating private details differently depending on who was listening. When I answered, he changed the meaning before he changed the facts. She went silent long enough for me to hear her breathing. Their arguments had stopped being about money, chores, or resentments, and had become arguments over whose memory counted. Trevor claimed Jocelyn twisted his words, while Jocelyn insisted he erased anything that made him responsible. She told me, "Yesterday he said, I pressured him to leave you, but when we met, he said your marriage was over." I did not correct her or offer comfort because the sentence carried everything she needed to hear. Trevor called again that evening and demanded to know what Jocelyn had told me. I answered, "Nothing you haven't already told 2 different ways." And he immediately accused us of comparing stories to punish him. Then he slowed his voice and insisted, "You know me better than she does. You know I never meant to hurt anyone." I remembered Eleanor's photographs, Miles's warning, and the sentence Trevor had carried from woman to woman. But this time there was no new audience ready to accept it. Jocelyn had begun checking his version against mine. Trevor was checking hers against his own, and neither could keep pretending the differences were misunderstandings. Their stories no longer protected them because reality had placed both versions in the same room. Months passed before Trevor reached out one final time. His voice no longer carried the certainty I remembered from the night he confessed the affair. And he lingered through long silences as though hoping I would rescue him from them. Finally, he admitted, "I keep replaying everything, and none of it sounds the way I remember saying it." I let the words settle because they echoed every conversation that had led us to this point. He asked whether I believed people could accidentally change their own memories after repeating the same story for years. I answered carefully, telling him I did not know what happened inside another person's mind, but I knew what happened outside it because every version I had heard eventually collided with someone else's memory. He breathed out slowly and whispered, "Maybe I started believing the version that hurt the least." It was the first sentence I had ever heard from Trevor that sounded less like persuasion and more like uncertainty. We sat in silence for several moments before he quietly admitted that Jocelyn had moved out weeks earlier. Neither of them had ended the relationship with a dramatic fight because, according to him, they had simply stopped agreeing on what had actually happened between them. Every conversation became an argument about the last conversation. He murmured, then gave a tired laugh that disappeared almost immediately. For the first time since our marriage ended, Trevor was describing consequences instead of explaining them away. When we finally stood to leave, he looked at me and asked one last question. Do you think I ever believed any of it? Or was I just trying to survive every ending? I told him I could not answer that for him because every person eventually has to separate memory from the story they choose to repeat. He nodded without arguing, thanked me for listening, and walked away without trying to convince me of anything. Watching him leave, I realized the man who had once rewritten every goodbye had finally reached the only ending no one else could rewrite for him. Several months have passed since that last conversation, and I no longer measure my life by the day Trevor walked away. The apartment that once felt unbearably quiet now carries ordinary sounds again. From coffee brewing before work to the soft click of books returning to their shelves after long evenings. Healing never arrived as one dramatic moment because it came through routines that no longer reminded me of what I had lost. I eventually understood that peace feels almost invisible until one day you realize you have stopped waiting for explanations. Sometimes friends still ask whether I ever found the answer Trevor was searching for during our final conversation. I always smile gently and tell them, that answer was never mine to find. They usually expect something sharper. But there is nothing left inside me that needs revenge to feel complete. The truth is simpler than the stories all of us carried for so long. Looking back, I no longer think the affair was the deepest betrayal. The hardest part was watching someone rewrite every ending until he could no longer recognize which version had actually happened. Once Trevor and Jocelyn began comparing those rewritten memories against each other, the stories finally reached the place where they could not survive. Reality did not expose them through punishment. It simply refused to keep changing shape for them. When I locked my front door that evening after Trevor's last visit, I realized I had finally closed the only chapter that still belonged to both of us. Now it belongs only to me, exactly as I remember living it, without needing anyone else's permission to believe it. If this story reminds you of someone who keeps rewriting yesterday every time tomorrow becomes uncomfortable, trust what you witnessed before you trust the version that arrives later. Some relationships end because love disappears, but others end because the truth eventually grows stronger than the story someone keeps repeating.